Hi, everyone. So for this particular week's module, or the current module that we're on, I'm going to be talking about different types of data collection. We've talked a lot about interviews and the nature of qualitative interviewing, and now I'm going to get into some other very common types of ways of collecting data in qualitative research and delve a little deeper into those tools so you have more tools in your toolbox in relation to qualitative research. And these are things you may end up engaging in sometime either during your degree or in any work you do after you earn your degree. So I want to talk about the concept of ethnography. Ethnography is key to qualitative research. It's not just in qualitative research. It's broadly a way of studying human systems and recording and describing those systems. So it started actually in anthropology with a real focus on the concept of studying and recording human cultures. It's also the descriptive work that's produced from that research. So an ethnography can be the act of studying, and it can also be the document that you produce. Many people use ethnography in dissertations and other types of large-scale research. And ethnography is often located within a very famous American cultural anthropologist named Margaret Mead. And so Margaret Mead studied the people of the South Pacific, in particular in Samoa, and she engaged in many years of very in-depth anthropological fieldwork. So she lived with these people, she observed their cultural practices, she created relationships and discussions with them to better understand and study and report on the experiences of that particular group of people. So her work became very representative of ethnographic practice, and she was often covered in popular media. You may have heard of her before, you may have studied her in other courses, especially if you've taken some anthropology courses. But she's kind of one of the modern faces of ethnography, and she really kind of became illustrative of ethnographic practice and really wrote a lot about field work and provided a lot of guidance as to how to do ethnography. She is a controversial figure, as many anthropologists are. If you've done any exploring of anthropology or any kinds of sort of social research, you'll know that there is also critiques of those types of research. And if you delve into Margaret Mead, you'll find some interesting things about her work and then some interesting things questioning her work. But she has this quote that is very illustrative of why we do ethnography. So she says, what people say, what people do, and what people say they do are entirely different things. And so we've talked about qualitative data collection in terms of doing interviews. Obviously, we're speaking to people about their experiences when we're doing an interview. And we're getting some ethnographic experience because we're also in the process of speaking with them. We're also recording the nonverbal things that are coming up in the discussion. But in ethnography, we're also stepping back and observing. So sometimes we're going into spaces and participating in those spaces either as an insider or an outsider and really deeply observing what's going on. And that is a way of kind of getting at what people say they do, but also what they actually do. And this concept of deep observation and deep reporting on that observation. And you actually have a couple of really nice TED Talks that have been assigned for this module that talk about this in I think, interesting ways that really illustrate this. So Ellen Isaacs, in her TED Talk, she discusses the power of ethnography, which she defines as observing people in their natural environments to better understand their needs. And she's involved in building technology. And so she talks about if you're building technology for people, you should watch them use it. And she shows a video. In the video, she shows an old video of people watching people use a Xerox copier. So if anyone's ever done any photocopying with especially some of the older photocopier machines, they can be very, very uncertain as to how to use. And I think that's a funny video that illustrates that people with very large capacities often get tripped up by technology. And we don't know what's not working sometimes in these areas until we until we observe people. So we can ask people what they want, but as Ellen Isaacs says, that only gets you so far because people sometimes don't know what they need. They know They know their experiences, but they can't observe some of the gaps in their experiences. And so if you watch people, you may notice gaps that they themselves haven't identified, and that these can be opportunities for innovation. So if you ask them about these things, they might not tell you about them. They might not even be all that conscious of them. But if you watch them doing things, then you can see what's going on. And so Isaacs used observation. She illustrates the observation through the example of the Xerox copier, but then she also talks about her own work and how she uses observation to better understand and improve parking systems. And she goes on to explain some of the ways in which she watches people using signs around whether they're allowed to park or not. And then she can understand the gaps in those signs or the confusions around those signs or those systems, and then work to improve them. So Ellen Isaacs' TED Talk illustrates how we can use the power of observation, the power of ethnographic research, to explore everyday experiences and problems and make them better. And this can happen in industry. So you may end up going into research, or you may end up going into working for a company, and you may want to use ethnography and other types of qualitative methods to help improve what the company is trying to do. And so ethnographers use a lot of tools. Of course, field notes are very key to ethnography. If you're engaging very deeply in a setting, then you're writing very deeply about that setting. So you're recording everything that you see, everything that you experience, everything that's around you. You also will engage in interviews using the kinds of interview techniques that we have talked about so far. So you can observe the surroundings, but you can also approach people and talk to them and ask them questions about what's going on. And sometimes if you do that in the setting that they're in, you can say, okay, I just saw you do this. Why did you do that? Say if it was for these user experiences around parking. Or you can get into the kinds of in-depth interview questions that we've already covered so far in terms of exploring people's experiences and the challenges and the opportunities that come out of those things. Mapping is often a common tool in ethnography. Surveys can be used as well. Things like photo and video can also be used, although they have attendant, of course, ethical concerns. And then also participation, as I've mentioned, is increasingly a key tool. So rather than just being an observer, you're being a participant who's engaging in the activity while also engaging in an ethnographic observation of the activity. So what does that mean? Participant observation is a main form of ethnography. And so this is a technique of field research where, and it sort of started in anthropology and sociology, where there is has been increasing use of qualitative research, but we also use it in health studies now, we use it in environmental studies, we use it in many, many different fields where qualitative perspectives are important. And this is where the investigator is a participant observer that studies the life of the group by sharing in its activities. And I myself am involved in this kind of work. I've mentioned the work I do with young people using arts-based approaches. When I'm doing that work, I engage in the art as well. So I don't just sit back and watch people making art together or watch people making their own art. I myself have my own art practice, and I engage in a solo practice, and I also bring my solo practice to the group, and I also engage in art making with the group together. So if we're creating something together, I'm engaging in it. I'm not just watching people create it. And so I am part of the creative process while I'm a qualitative researcher doing observation on the process. So I'm observing my own process as well as the process of the other people that I'm working with. And there's also another TED Talk that you have been assigned for this module where Robin Nagel talks about using participant observation to answer the research question, who cleans up after us? So this is interesting because Robin Nagel is very interested in sanitation workers and their experiences and the job of cleaning up trash in large cities, in particular in New York City, and the very important work that's done there, but often the sometimes unseen work or the not very visible work, and quite frankly, the stigmatized work. So rather than just researching this, rather than just talking to people about it, rather than just watching sanitation workers do their job, she actually became a sanitation worker. And so she herself took on the job of a sanitation worker to better understand the experiences of this group and to build better waste systems, both for the workers and for communities. So she wasn't satisfied with being an outsider. She became an insider, took on the actual job she was studying because she wanted to better influence the systems and make them better. And there's a lot of solidarity in her talk in relation to the impacts of this work on the people doing it and the importance of this work for society and sometimes the unseen importance. It's a very interesting talk. And so participant observation, it has a lot of power. It can provide insights that are rich. It can develop relationships that are important. In my own work, it has been very key to dealing with the power relationships, which I've already spoken about a few times in relation to the work that I'm doing. And I can't really understand what I'm seeing until I have a relationship with people to really understand the broader nature of who they are and what they're bringing to this work. So I talk to them about their experiences, but by engaging together with those experiences, there's a richness of information that is provided. Um, so it can help us tap into things that we otherwise wouldn't be able to uncover or that have been previously unknown. Of course, this does take a lot of time. So that is one of the challenges of this kind of work. Is that it isn't something, in-depth interviews, maybe they just take an hour for each interview. But participant observation usually requires developing relationships. It requires engaging in, pre-work before you go into the setting. So you might have to, develop an opening where you develop a familiarity with a setting, which might mean showing up to that setting multiple times before you actually even develop a relationship with somebody. So if I'm talking about working in an agency like Sketch, where I work right now, I started hanging out at that agency for many months before I actually engaged in the research that I was doing. So I just so people could get familiar with me, they could get to know who I am. They could recognize my face. They could have individual conversations with me. We could share meals together, and I could become less of a stranger. And then after that experience of building relationships, then I could go into more in-depth relationship building where it was, I'd like to be part of your projects and I'd like to help you understand what's happening and be a co-researcher with you and invite you to be researchers with me on this work. And so that takes a long time. And for the examples like anthropology and people like Margaret Mead, it's many years of time. So they develop relationships where they sometimes are following families over many, many years, and developing very in-depth experiences with them in order to have a very rich understanding of the thing that they're studying or the group that they're studying or the system that they're trying to provide some sense of recording and meaning. So that it can be fed back to the larger research community and hopefully the human community, because we want to do research that's helping people, not just furthering research, as we've already talked about. So it takes a lot of diligence. It takes a lot of documentation. Good ethnographers write almost a book for every ethnography that they do. So they're really writing a lot of detail, and recording everything that they see and experience. And also there is the challenge of subjectivity. So when I mentioned Margaret Mead and some of the controversy around her, and controversy around things like anthropology in general, there have been challenges to some of the accounts that people have made, especially when they are outsider accounts. So people from different lived experiences are going into very foreign settings and observing them and then coming back with impressions that sometimes maybe might not actually jive with the impressions of the people who live there. So obviously we want to do work, a lot of reflexivity work, as we've talked about last week. There's always going to be subjectivity. As we've covered in terms of the way we see knowledge in qualitative research, there's no one truth. However, one does want to be careful not to have a completely outsider perspective that mischaracterizes what we're seeing. And so doing good ethnography definitely means engaging very deeply in relation, thinking very reflexively about power dynamics, and being willing to be called on when your impressions maybe don't match those of the group that you're working with. And hopefully we have over time asked a lot of critical questions in this work to get better at this work. But yes, these are some of the tensions that exist within qualitative research in general and participant observation in particular. The other type of data collection that I'd like to talk about, which is also very common in qualitative research, is the focus group. So this is a common qualitative research method. It is used in formal research projects, and it's also used in user testing and quality testing for products and in sort of business kind of settings. So similar to the setting that Ellen Isaacs was talking about and how she used a participant observation, you'll also find in business people using focus groups to get a sense of how people use products, to get a sense of what people want from certain products, but you also find it in very formal research projects. So focus groups are small, in-depth group discussions, and they're similar to qualitative interviews in that they have somewhat of a structure, but they're also meant to unfold like a conversation. So there are questions, then there are probing questions that help to uncover the answers to those questions, similar to what we've seen in qualitative interviews. But the key difference here, of course, is that as opposed to interviews, which are one-on-one discussions, focus groups are small group discussions. So there's a group dynamic to the discussion. So focus groups, being group discussions, are really intended to identify beliefs and opinions of a selected group of people. So we use focus groups because we want to understand something across a group dynamic. In-depth interviews are more for a detailed picture of one individual experience. So there's another video that you were assigned for this module by my colleague from the University of Toronto, Izumi Nakamoto, and she discusses, she provides a really nice in-depth discussion of focus groups. And she talks about how they're helpful for generating a variety of ideas in an efficient manner because you have input from many people in one session. So focus groups can be quite helpful if you want to get a variety of more in-depth perspectives. You don't want to use a survey. You want to be able to probe. You want to be able to ask questions in real time, but you want to get a variety of ideas or responses or input from a variety of people. Certainly you can conduct multiple one-on-one interviews, but that's going to take you longer to get the variety. A focus group, if you do several focus groups, you're going to have input from a larger group of people. Izumi also highlights how focus groups can be flexible, and she talks about how she uses them alongside arts-based research methods. So you can have a group discussion, then you can have people engage in something like a more creative exercise, and then you can have them talk about the creative experience and how that informs the group discussion. So you can use different techniques within a focus group. You can use talking, but you can also use things like arts-based exploration or creative brainstorming and then inform that into the discussion. So they can be quite flexible. But the group format, of course, is the benefit of the focus group, but it also provides some challenges. So the biggest challenge really lies in group dynamics. So when you're doing with a one-on-one interview, you have a group dynamic between you and the person you're talking to. But when you're dealing with the focus group, you have a group dynamic across multiple people. So this gets a little bit more complicated. So group dynamics might influence the responses that people are making. There may be power differentials inside the group. There may be prior relationships that influence the discussion and the way people answer the questions that are asked. And there may be just personality types. There may be people who are more talkative. There may be people who are more dominant. There may be people who are very shy and not that talkative. And how is that going to influence the way they respond to your research questions? So focus groups are useful because, again, they provide this group, a group response. So they provide response from multiple people. And they also provide interaction between people, which can be very interesting for some research questions. But they do limit the amount of control that the researcher has over the data. Because of these group dynamics, the researcher has less control over getting the responses they're looking for because there may be influences on the way people are responding because of the group dynamics. Focus groups can also generate discomfort. There may be triggering things that come up in a focus group. There may be discomfort between particular people in the focus group. There may be challenging responses that some people disagree with, and so they can be difficult spaces where you need a strong group facilitator. So, if you're going to go into doing focus groups, or if you've already done some focus groups, you will be or will want to be aware that you want to really hone in on your group facilitation skills. They require a lot of complex and sensitive facilitating in order to generate a discussion that allows everybody to have the ability to participate. So the group format of course, comes with limits as well to confidentiality. So that's the other challenge of focus groups, is that you will, with focus groups, just like with in-depth interviews, you engage in a consent process. You ensure that everybody's comfortable with the rules and the opportunities to share the kinds of questions that are going to come up, and also, hopefully, and you have them sign this in the consent form, that they will not share things outside of the group, that they will respect the confidentiality of the participants who are part of the research with them, that they're hearing their responses in the group discussion. But of course, you can't guarantee this, and the more people that hear each other's responses, the more limits to confidentiality that exist. So there is that aspect of the group dynamic that is, of course, quite important when we think about our ethical imperatives in relation to research and in relation to qualitative inquiry. So, given all of this, interviews are a better tool when the topic is highly sensitive or personal. So if you're talking about an illness, if you're talking about a social location that might have some challenging nature to it or some unfortunate stigma, then you might want to do an interview, and you might want to avoid the focus group dynamic. Interviews are also a better tool when group interactions may be detrimental, when there may be triggering things that might come up. And it's also, interviews are also more useful when it's easier to reach people one-on-one, because putting together a focus group requires recruiting a group of people to come to one setting and show up at the same time. And sometimes that can be harder or easier depending on who you're working with. And also, if you're working with populations that are very geographically dispersed, it's going to be hard to get that group of people together in one setting. So sometimes interviews are better in that context. Now, of course, with the technology that's growing and with our increasing requirement to use technology to interact during this pandemic, more and more people are doing group discussions using technology, and so that's removing that geographic barrier. But it might still be important, especially when we're able to get together in groups again, to be in person for the kind of research that you're doing. And so that could be a challenge to bring everybody in person. And in this case, you might want to do interviews if you need to go out to the people to meet with them in person. And interviews are also a better tool when you're trying to get really in-depth information from one person. So you're really trying to go deep with a question, and you want to do a lot of probing. Because if you have 5 or 10 people in a focus group, you can't probe with each person very deeply. You can ask follow-up questions, but you want to get a range of responses, so you're only going to be able to really go so far with each individual. But focus groups are a better tool when you want some kind of discussion. So you might want to debate the issue. You might want to have people in a small group discussion talking about different perspectives about the issue or the question. You might want the interaction between the people might be what's of interest to you in the research. So if you're trying to explore common trends, or you're also just trying to generate ideas, and this is why people use them a lot for market research, as I mentioned. So maybe you want to get together a group of young moms and talk about what are the needs of young moms in relation to children's strollers, for example, and what have been your experiences, and what have been the problems, and what have been the needs. Maybe you just want to generate a really big brainstorming from across a large group of people, and they come up with different ideas, and then they either disagree or agree with one another's ideas to come to some kind of sort of consensus about what the main needs are. So if you're doing something very exploratory, or if you're doing something where you want to really get into a discussion talking about the different perspectives, then focus groups can be really helpful. And of course, in qualitative research, we usually have to do more than one focus group or more than one interview, because we're trying to get a range of perspectives. And so this can be a question as to how many different versions of these do we need to do. So if your sample is more heterogeneity, it's more heterogeneous, which means that group members have different attitudes, they have different knowledges, they come from different experiences, especially in relation to your research question, then you're going to need more focus groups in order to capture the range of perspectives. So if you're dealing with a group that is quite different, or individuals that are quite different from one another, then you're going to want to conduct more focus groups. If you're dealing with a group that is more homogeneous, which means they're similar across their demographics, across their experiences with relation to the question or the issue you're exploring, then you won't need as many groups, because they are going to come to a similar range of views and opinions. And often in qualitative research, what we do is we repeat the focus groups until we start seeing the same things coming up over and over again. And then we think to ourselves, okay, I feel like I've gotten a sufficient range of perspectives, because I'm not getting much new coming out. I'm hearing the same stuff over and over again. But the rule of thumb really is that if you have a heterogeneous group, then you want to do more focus groups. If you have a homogeneous participant group, then you can do less focus groups. And coming back to Izumi's discussion of focus groups in her video, she talks about how you want to consider, there's a bit of complexity to this, because you want to consider both heterogeneity, which is the diversity, but you also want to consider commonality. And so she gives the example of avoiding someone being in the group from only one participant minority group. So you might want diversity, but if you have mostly cisgender people and only one transgender person, then you're putting a lot of pressure on that person, of course, to speak for that diversity. So you need to really balance the intersecting identities, in particular in relation to the experience that you're exploring. So you want to be sensitive to this concept of diversity and commonality when you're considering the group dynamics and considering how to put together this small group of people that you're going to engage in a research discussion with. The other thing that's important to think about for both interviews and focus groups is setting. And so key factors in the setting, where are you going to conduct this discussion, are really accessibility and space. And of course, you want to create a space that is accessible to the person. You want to think about the time of day. You want to think about the travel that it takes to get to that space. Sometimes we actually give, we reimburse people for whatever travel costs they have, because you're asking them to come to a particular space. Or if you think it's more accessible, you can come to them. But you really want to think about that whole angle of how they're getting there and what is their experience when they're there. For interviews, you want to think about how you provide privacy, and that's going to be important for you when you think about doing your interview, that you want to make sure that you're in a private space and want to encourage your participant to find a private space so that you can have a really comfortable discussion. And for focus groups, you want to also think about the space in relation to the group dynamics. So you want a space that's large enough that people can hear each other, but not too large that you can't capture the discussion using your recording device, and that people aren't so far away from each other or not too close to each other. So you want a good space, and this can be a challenge with focus groups, because sometimes you're doing focus groups in a community setting, and you might have a hard time finding a space that's appropriate. And so this is something to think about when you're facilitating, is really going to the space, especially when you're doing something like facilitating a focus group, because as I mentioned, that requires a adept facilitation. It requires some facilitation skills. And so you want to be in a space where you can really provide the facilitation. And so going to the space beforehand, getting a sense of how comfortable it is, how hot or cold it might be, if there's any distracting noises around, how you can find a quiet spot within that space. That could be really important for focus groups to create a really comfortable and ease of discussion. And so some key factors when you're designing focus groups: how many people are you going to have in the group? It's very challenging to facilitate a group that's larger than about 8 people. And the more people, the more voices, the more dynamics, the more challenges you might encounter. And especially if you're starting to do this work in the first stages, you probably want to have smaller groups rather than larger groups, and then you get a sense of comfort and familiarity with the facilitation skills required. But ideally, sort of the rule of thumb is around 6 to 8 people. Sometimes it's good to have 2 facilitators in a focus group, because it can be exhausting to do this kind of facilitation. And it often is important to be able to bounce off of each other if things are coming up that are challenging, or even just in order to capture the range of perspectives. So in focus groups, we often have sometimes two facilitators and additionally a note taker that doesn't facilitate, that just writes things down. Because it's very hard to take notes when you're doing complex facilitation. So you can have somebody who's taking care of that. And then you can have, I like to have two facilitators when I'm doing focus groups, because we can trade off of each other, because then one person doesn't have to do all of the complex facilitation. And then it's also really useful if there are any challenges. So if you are experiencing a particular challenging individual in a focus group and they are talking to you in a challenging way as a facilitator, your co-facilitator can sometimes diffuse that. Because sometimes a group dynamic some kind of dynamic gets created where there's one person challenging one of the facilitators, and the other facilitator can help jump in or just sort of take the heat off that person, and give them a moment, even if it's just a minute, to not have to speak, so that they can regroup their thoughts and then come back into the discussion. So it can be very helpful to have that kind of co-facilitation dynamic in a focus group. We also sometimes have recorders that are responsible for running the technology, or if it's not an individual, then we definitely usually, just like in our in-depth interviews, we have some kind of device to record the discussion. Again, it's very hard, even harder in a focus group, to take notes and capture the discussion if you don't have a recording of the discussion. So you usually do want a device, a tape recording device to record the discussion, or you have a person who's typing everything out or typing the main points of the discussion, and that's they're a person who's doing the recording. We also want to provide comfort again in a focus group. And usually, often, not always, but often in focus groups, we might provide food and drink. We might provide something that makes people at ease. We also don't know if people have had a meal recently, so we want them to be in a space that they're able to participate fully. And so we often, and as I mentioned in my own work, I was sharing many meals with the participants before we started doing our work together. It's also it's a very communal way to get to know people and to feel comfortable in sharing food and drink, and doing that either before or after the session, often before the session, creates a nice atmosphere. And certainly in my work, we always do we make plans to have a meal available to participants so that they have food available to them, and that we also kind of create that convivial, human-centered environment. And again, as I mentioned with the last slide, the space can be very, very important, and a quiet space. I can't tell you the amount of focus groups I've done that were really amazing discussions, and then I went back and listened to the recording, and there's all these noises, in particular traffic noises and ambient sounds around and people talking in the background, and I can't really understand the discussion very well in the tape recording. So, a quiet, comfortable space is key to capturing your data. And in terms of the question of how long do these last, as I mentioned with in-depth interviews, they usually last about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour. If you're getting into a really, really good discussion, they might go to an hour and a half. Focus groups last a little bit longer because there's multiple people talking. So you can find that they will go on average 2 hours. Sometimes that's not all of that is the focus group. Some of it is the setup time, and then the time afterwards where people might just be kind of engaging with each other. So in terms of the whole food and drink, you might have food beforehand, or have like a couple minutes, 10 minutes for people to take their coffee and get settled. And then at the end, they might also have time to engage with one another, because they might at that point want to spend a little more time with one another. And they've just had a discussion that has generated some interesting points. So it's nice to spend some time together rather than just sort of end the group and everybody leaves all at once, and that's sort of an abrupt ending. So focus groups can take a few hours. Sometimes they can even take several hours if you're really doing a lot of setup and you're giving people a lot of time afterwards. And if you get a really chatty group, then you can actually sometimes get 2 hours of discussion. If you do think that you're going to generate a lot of discussion, then you sometimes will also plan for a break at some point in that discussion, because it can get can get long for people to be engaging for such a long time with one another, especially if it's an intense kind of a discussion. So focus groups typically require a longer time frame than interviews. And I think I'll wrap up by talking about this concept of facilitation. So there's lots of resources out there on how to facilitate focus groups. You just have to type in focus groups into any kind of search engine, and you will find lots of very good resources from scholarly peer-reviewed places that talk about focus group and facilitation skills. In some of the SAGE resources that I provided links to in the syllabus, there is some really in-depth key sort of tips and documents about how to facilitate a focus group. So SAGE Research Methods is a really good place to go to find information about how to collect qualitative data in general and how to do focus groups. But I'll just highlight some of the key things that if you're going to facilitate a focus group, you should have sort of a checklist around and think about and practice. So of course I just said room setup, but also prep. Just like with the interviews, but even more so, you want to know your questions, you want to know your probes like the back of your hand, because now you've got multiple people talking, you've got all this facilitation to do. You don't want to be looking back at your sheet every minute or two to say to yourself, what's the next question? What was the probing question in relation to that question? You want to have a really good sense of the things you want to ask and how the research is going to unfold. You also want to monitor group dynamics and the pacing of the discussion. So you might have to intervene sometimes to clarify things if something comes up that's confusing, and you might have to sort of like probe if people are talking about, for example, this idea of consensus and disagreement. If people are talking about all negative things, then you might want to go in with a probe and say, okay, great, I hear you really surfacing the challenges. Can we talk about some of the things that are working in relation to this question? Or can we get to more consensus-oriented versus disagreement-oriented kinds of discussions? So you might want to probe to manage the discussion. If it's going in one direction and you feel like it's already stayed in that area long enough, then you might want to shift it into another aspect of the discussion. You need to do your active listening. It's very, very important in focus groups, and again, more challenging because you need to listen to multiple voices. And in the context of active listening, it can also be super important in focus groups to summarize back the responses of participants. Again, if there's something that's unclear, if there's something that seems to be confusing to people, or if there's an opportunity to kind of briefly summarize, okay, what I hear people saying is this, so that the group can then say, okay, that's interesting, and build on that idea. And I guess I'll finish off with the concept of facilitation challenges and what to think about in relation to how to manage the challenges of facilitation, which I've already brought up a few times. So you might get an overly dominant participant, and often this is one of the key things that happens in focus groups that you have to navigate through. So somebody who feels like they're the expert on this topic, they may or may not have a lot of experience, but they may be very, very vocal about whatever experience they do have, and they might dominate the discussion. So obviously you have a group of people, you want to hear from everybody, and if you've got one person who's jumping in all the time, that's going to be a challenge. So you need to develop ways of saying, thank you, I've heard from you, I'd like to hear from someone else right now, or facilitating around someone who's dominating the discussion. You, on the other hand, might get people who are more quiet, that are a bit shy, that for whatever reason they might be more introverted in general, or they might just find themselves shy in the group dynamics of this particular discussion. So you might need to pull them out a little bit more and say, I feel like there's something really interesting that you have to share, and I want to give you the space to share it. That might also be people who are reflective in that they might take longer to formulate their answers. So with more dominant talkers, they might be right away have a really good idea of what they want to say about this question. And then there might be people who need a couple of seconds to think about the answer, but they have something very important to share, but they don't jump in right away, and the dominant person kind of takes over the stage, and then you don't get to hear what they were starting to formulate, the idea that is coming forward from them. So these are the kinds of sort of techniques and sort of sensitivities that that one brings to a really good focus group facilitation. And then you might get people who ramble. And, I think all of us probably have had experiences where we're trying to say something and we say it in ways where, it takes time for us to unpack our idea. So, it's not a bad thing for people to be thinking out loud during a focus group discussion. Sometimes the richest stuff comes from that. But then you also might want to shut some of that down if person's going completely off topic or if they're repeating themselves multiple times. So focus group facilitation requires listening, but it also requires coming into the discussion when necessary in order to keep the discussion on topic, and keep it moving, and sort of ensure that there's space and time for everybody to speak and for the next questions to be asked. So as you can imagine, these are the kinds of complex dynamics I've been talking about in terms of the facilitation of focus groups. And then you might get group members who are uncooperative for whatever reason. I mentioned when the idea of having two facilitators. Typically you've got a group that is coming together because they understand the research and want to be part of it and are respectful of the research. But every once in a while, you might have a person who is not respectful, and is just really disrupting the group. And so again, this is where it can be useful to have a co-facilitator. And in general, you're going to want to have a challenge for how you manage that, and have kind of sensitive probes to say, okay, can we come to a place where we can have a better discussion here? And I'm finding this moment difficult. I think other group members might be as well. So how do we reframe this discussion in a more positive light, perhaps? Or sometimes you might go back to the consent form and say, this discussion is not unfolding the way that we decided in our consent form that we would, in a respectful manner. And I need to ask you to refocus on the respect to the group. And if you can't do that, I need to ask you to leave the group. So these are some of the things, and some of the ways that you can think about how you might prepare and manage through some of the facilitation challenges that could come up. And you as well, sometimes, depending on the research question, might get people who are challenging one another to the point of actually fighting with one another or very strongly disagreeing. And so how are you going to manage if there is conflict within the group? Again, usually your consent form will list some principles like respect that you want to have for one another, that you can go back to and say, we're allowed to disagree in this space. This is bringing up a lot of complex and powerful emotions. I'm very interested in everybody sharing what's going on for them, but we need to do that in a respectful manner. And it is sometimes does happen that you get to the point in a group where there is so much conflict that you have to stop the group. It's very rare, but it can happen in focus groups. So it's something that you need to be ready for, especially if the research that you're doing is something that you think might bring up strong disagreements or challenges. Okay, I think that is the key elements of the data collection pieces that I wanted to cover. I do really invite you, if you haven't done so yet, to watch the videos that are assigned. I think that there's a lot of really depth and interesting examples and experiences shared by those people as well, to give you a nice sense of these different techniques. And I hope you do explore and use them in your own work and your own research.